July 16th, 1969. Launch Complex 39 at Kennedy Space Center. 500 million people watching on television, the largest audience in history. Saturn V rocket, 363 feet tall, 6.2 million pounds. Countdown reaches 0. 7.6 million pounds of thrust. Flames erupt. The ground shakes for miles. Apollo 11 lifts off. 3 men inside. Destination: the moon. Total cost to get them there: $25.8 billion. That's $257 billion in today's money. And while the rocket climbed toward space, 24 million Americans lived below the poverty line with no plan to escape. This is the story of the year we chose to leave Earth instead of fixing it. Here's what $25.8 billion bought. 13 years of research, 400,000 workers, 32,000 contractors, 1,200 companies across every state. Peak spending, 1966, $5.9 billion in 1 year, 4.4% of the entire federal budget. More than the Department of Housing and Urban Development's entire budget. More than federal spending on education. More than urban renewal programs combined. All of it going to NASA to build rockets, test spacecraft, train astronauts, to put humans somewhere they'd never been. And this is where it turns. Because 1969 wasn't a moment of unlimited national wealth. It was a moment of profound domestic crisis. 1969, U.S. poverty rate, 12.1%, 24.1 million people. That's 1 in 8 Americans living below the federal poverty line. Urban poverty worse. New York City, 22%, over 12% above the national rate. Newark, 27%. Detroit, 26%. Cities collapsing, infrastructure crumbling, schools failing, crime rising. And the federal government response: cut social programs. Because NASA needed the money, not explicitly, not with announcement. But budget allocation tells the truth about priorities. NASA budget 1966, $5.9 billion. Total war on poverty spending same year, $1.7 billion. 3 times more money going to the moon than to fighting poverty on Earth. But here's what nobody calculated. The cost per person. $25.8 billion divided by 3 astronauts landing on the moon. $8.6 billion per person. Meanwhile, the average federal welfare payment to a family of 4 in 1969, $1,800 per year. You could have supported 4.7 million families in poverty for a year with Apollo 11's budget alone. Instead, 3 men walked on the moon, and every elected official in Washington called it the greatest achievement in human history. July 20th, 1969. Eagle lunar module touches down. Sea of Tranquility. Neil Armstrong. The Eagle has landed. Mission control erupts. Cheering. Celebrations. American flags waving. 6.5 hours later, Armstrong opens the hatch. Descends the ladder. That's 1 small step for man. 1 giant leap for mankind. Broadcast to 600 million people worldwide. The most watched television event in history. And while the cameras focused on the moon, the cameras weren't pointed at Harlem, or Watts, or the south side of Chicago, where Americans lived in conditions NASA wouldn't accept for astronaut housing. This is the pattern that defines 1969. Spectacular achievement masking systemic neglect. National pride distracting from national crisis. A technological triumph built on the foundation of abandoned promises. Because here's what else was happening in July 1969 while Apollo 11 flew to the moon. Cleveland, Glenville neighborhood, 57% poverty rate. No grocery stores, no banks, no investment. Buildings condemned, streets unrepaired, garbage uncollected. Federal housing funds, frozen. Urban renewal projects, canceled. Infrastructure maintenance, deferred. But NASA got $5.9 billion that year. And nobody asked whether the priorities were wrong. Because you can't criticize the moon landing during a moon landing. But it gets worse. The Apollo program wasn't sold as escapism. It was sold as investment. President Kennedy. September 1962, Rice University. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The promise. Technology developed for space would revolutionize life on Earth. New materials, new medicine, new infrastructure, spin-off benefits that would justify the cost by improving everyone's lives. That was the sales pitch. The reality, almost none of it materialized in 1969, or 1970, or 1975. Tang and Velcro became the punchline. Meanwhile, the 24 million Americans in poverty saw zero improvement from moon landing technology. Because you can't eat Tang, and Velcro doesn't pay rent. And this is where the moral imbalance locks in. The decision to fund Apollo wasn't made by the people who paid for it. Congress authorized the spending. NASA executed the program. Contractors built the hardware. But the families living in poverty never got a vote on whether going to the moon was worth sacrificing programs that might have lifted them out of poverty. One group decided the priority. Another group paid the cost. And 57 years later, we still celebrate the decision without acknowledging what it cost. July 24th, 1969. Apollo 11 splashes down in the Pacific. Successful mission. All 3 astronauts safe. Parades, celebrations, presidential medals. Richard Nixon meets them on the aircraft carrier. Calls it the greatest week in history since creation. And 2 weeks later, Nixon proposes cutting urban development funding by 30%. Not because the programs failed, because the budget couldn't support both space exploration and social programs. Something had to give. Space won, cities lost. Here's what the numbers actually show. Federal spending on housing and community development, 1966, $3.1 billion. 1969, $2.7 billion. 13% cut, while NASA's budget stayed above $5 billion. Model Cities program, designed to revitalize urban neighborhoods, chronically underfunded. Head Start, early childhood education for low-income families, capped enrollment. Food stamp program, limited expansion. All of them constrained because the federal budget prioritized space over Earth. And nobody with power to change it saw a problem. Because the moon landing proved America could do anything, except fix the problems at home. But here's what makes it irreversible. Once Apollo 11 succeeded, the justification for the program evaporated. Mission accomplished. Moon reached. Space race won. NASA's budget collapsed immediately. 1970, $3.7 billion, down 30% from peak. 1975, $3.2 billion. Apollo program canceled after Apollo 17. No return to the moon planned. And this is the part they don't talk about. The money didn't redirect to cities or poverty programs. It just disappeared into deficit reduction and Vietnam War costs. The choice wasn't space versus social programs. It was space instead of social programs. And once space ended, social programs still didn't get funded. The 24 million Americans in poverty in 1969 stayed in poverty. The cities collapsing in 1969 kept collapsing. Nothing changed, except 3 men walked on the moon. And everyone agreed it was worth it. This is what the Apollo 11 launch represents. Not triumph. Escape. America had problems in 1969 it couldn't solve. Urban decay, racial inequality, economic stagnation, political division. The moon landing didn't solve any of them. It distracted from them. For 8 days, the nation watched astronauts travel to another world and forgot about the millions of Americans living in poverty in this one. That's not cynicism. That's what the budget priorities prove. $5.9 billion for NASA. $1.7 billion for the war on poverty. The choice was made. The consequences lasted 50 years. And every time someone celebrates Apollo 11 as humanity's greatest achievement, they're celebrating a moment when America decided escape was easier than repair. The rocket launched. The problems stayed behind. And nobody with power to fix them was watching. They were all looking at the moon. July 17th, 1969. 3 days before the moon landing. York, Pennsylvania. A black teenager, Taka Sweeney, shot by police during a curfew stop. Hours later, riots erupt. Buildings burn. Streets barricade. Fights break out across the city. More than 60 injured. 100 arrested. Entire blocks ablaze. And while York burned, every television network in America prepared cameras to point at the moon. Not at the fires, at the rocket. This is the pattern of 1969. Cities collapsing while the nation celebrated escape. Here's what was happening in American cities while NASA prepared for Apollo 11. Newark, New Jersey. 2 years after the 1967 riots. 26 people killed, 700 injured, 1,000 arrested, $10 million in property damage. And in 1969, nothing had been rebuilt. Vacant lots where buildings burned. Shattered storefronts still boarded up. Businesses that fled never returned. Unemployment remained crushing. Housing remained substandard. Police remained disproportionately white. The National Guard had restored order in 1967. But order isn't recovery. Newark in 1969 looked like a war zone 2 years after the war ended. Detroit, July 1967. 5 days of rioting. 43 dead. 1,200 buildings destroyed. 7,000 arrests. The army deployed. Tanks in the streets. Helicopters overhead. And 2 years later, in July 1969, while America watched the moon landing, Detroit's population was in freefall. 1.8 million residents in 1960. 1.5 million in 1969. 300,000 people left in 9 years. Most of them white. Most of them middle class. All of them taking their tax dollars with them. What remained? A majority black population in a city designed for twice as many people, with half the tax base and infrastructure collapsing from lack of maintenance. But this is where it gets worse. The riots of 1964 through 1968 didn't cause the urban crisis. They revealed it. Cities had been deteriorating for decades, manufacturing jobs disappearing, housing degrading, services declining. The riots made it visible, made it undeniable. And the federal response was to fund a moon landing. Not metaphorically, literally. President Johnson. February 1968. Special message to Congress on urban problems. Today, America's cities are in crisis. This clear and urgent warning rises from the decay of decades. Johnson requested funds for urban renewal, Model Cities program, housing for the poor. Congress approved a fraction of what he asked for. Meanwhile, NASA's budget for 1968, $4.6 billion. More than twice what Congress allocated for all urban programs combined. And this is where the priorities lock in. July 20th, 1969. Apollo 11 lands on the moon. 600 million people watching worldwide. The most significant technological achievement in human history. And at the exact moment Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, 27% of Newark lived in poverty, 26% of Detroit, 22% of New York City. Cities with infrastructure built for prosperity now serving populations in crisis. And the federal government spending $5.9 billion on space, while urban renewal programs received 1/10 that amount. But here's what nobody talks about. The cities that burned in the 1960s didn't recover. Not in the 70s, not in the 80s, not for decades. because the moment the riots stopped, national attention evaporated. The 1967 Newark riots made international news, shocked the nation, prompted federal investigation. And by 1969, while Newark still looked like a bombed-out city, the nation had moved on to the moon. Detroit's population loss after the 1967 riots accelerated. Many of its remaining middle-class and affluent residents, as well as much of its white working-class population, left, and they weren't fleeing crime or violence. They were fleeing disinvestment. The federal government chose not to rebuild these cities, chose not to fund housing programs at scale, chose not to invest in infrastructure or education or economic development. And when residents with options saw no future, they left. The ones who stayed had no choice. This is the trade-off nobody admits. $5.9 billion for NASA in 1969? That money could have rebuilt Newark entirely, could have funded housing, rehabilitation for every substandard unit in Detroit, could have fully staffed schools in every impoverished neighborhood in New York. Instead, it launched 3 men to the moon. And the cities that needed rebuilding got Model Cities program funding, $500 million for fiscal 1969. Less than 10% of NASA's budget, spread across every struggling city in America. Each city receiving a fraction, enough to study the problem, not enough to solve it. But it gets worse. Urban renewal, the primary federal program for city redevelopment, was actively destructive in 1969. Not failing, destructive. Here's how it worked. Federal funds authorized demolition of slum housing. Thousands of low-income residents displaced. Land cleared for new development. But new housing construction lagged years behind demolition. Displaced families had nowhere to go. Housing in remaining neighborhoods overcrowded and subjected to high tax rates. So the program designed to help cities demolished housing faster than it built replacements, leaving residents worse off than before. And while urban renewal bulldozed neighborhoods, NASA built launch pads. July 1969, Buffalo, New York. Participating in the collapse of the Rust Belt, lost 150,000 residents since 1950. That's 21% of the city's population. Gone. Manufacturing base eroded. Tax base shrinking. Infrastructure aging without replacement. And the federal response? Nothing. No emergency intervention. No special funding. No infrastructure investment. Buffalo wasn't unique. Cleveland, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Milwaukee. Every industrial city facing the same pattern. Jobs disappearing. Residents fleeing. Tax base collapsing. And while they spiraled into crisis, the federal government spent $25.8 billion to reach the moon. This is what makes it irreversible. Once a city enters decline, recovery requires massive investment, not loans, not tax incentives, not public-private partnerships, direct federal spending, infrastructure, housing, education, jobs. The scale of investment that built the interstate highway system or funded the Apollo program. But cities never received Apollo-level investment. They received Model Cities grants that studied poverty without ending it. Urban renewal programs that demolished more than they built. Housing assistance that served a fraction of those who needed it. And by the time Apollo 11 landed, the federal government had made its priorities clear. Space, unlimited funding until mission accomplished. Cities, minimal funding spread thin across maximum need. But here's the part that defines 1969. The moon landing didn't just distract from urban crisis. It justified ignoring it. Because if America could put a man on the moon, then obviously the nation was capable of solving any problem. And if cities remained in crisis, it must be because the people living in them failed. Not because the federal government chose rockets over renewal. This became the narrative. American exceptionalism proved by technological triumph. Urban decay blamed on individual failure instead of policy abandonment. And 57 years later, The cities that burned in the 1960s still bear the scars. Vacant lots in Newark still not redeveloped. Neighborhoods in Detroit still depopulated. Infrastructure in Buffalo still crumbling. Not because these cities couldn't recover. Because recovery required investment at the scale the federal government reserved for space exploration. And once Apollo succeeded, even space didn't get that funding anymore. Cities never had a chance. July 24th, 1969, Apollo 11 splashes down. Mission complete. Astronauts safe. America celebrates. And that same week, the Model Cities program, designed to revitalize America's worst urban neighborhoods, received $500 million in funding. Less than 10% of what NASA spent that year. Split among 63 cities, each receiving an average of $8 million to solve decades of disinvestment, infrastructure collapse, and economic abandonment. $8 million per city, while 3 astronauts received $8.6 billion worth of support to walk on the moon. That's the calculation that defined 1969. Spectacular achievement for 3 people, systemic abandonment for millions. And everyone agreed the moon landing proved America's greatness, while the cities burned in silence. Not riots anymore, just slow collapse, block by block, year by year, while the cameras pointed at the sky. July 20th, 1969. 400,000 people working on the Apollo program. Engineers, technicians, machinists, welders, electricians, assembly workers, spread across every state. 1,200 companies, 32,000 contractors, building the Saturn V, testing the lunar module, fabricating spacesuits, writing software. And when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, every one of those 400,000 workers watched, knowing they built that moment, and knowing most of them wouldn't have jobs a year later. Here's what happened to NASA's workforce after Apollo 11. Peak employment, 1965, 410,700 people, 34,300 NASA employees, 376,700 contractors. By July 1970, 1 year after the moon landing, the Kennedy Space Center workforce dropped from 23,500 to 16,500. 7,000 jobs gone in 12 months. Pan American World Airways, managing NASA tracking stations, laid off at least 750 workers in 1 week. And the layoffs accelerated. January 1970. NASA announced 50,000 jobs would be eliminated. 1 year after the greatest technological achievement in history, NASA fired 1/8 of its workforce, not because the program failed, because it succeeded. This is where the human cost becomes visible. These weren't abstract budget cuts. They were engineers who spent a decade perfecting rocket engines, now unemployed. Technicians who tested every component of the lunar module, given pink slips. Families who relocated to Florida or Texas or California for NASA careers, now facing foreclosure. Brevard County, Florida, home to Kennedy Space Center. Population doubled from 1960 to 1969. 115,000 to 230,000. Built on the space boom. And after Apollo 11, the county endured a year of economic devastation, for sale signs and shattered personal ambitions. Not a ghost town. But the boom ended. Property values collapsed. Businesses closed. Families left. All of them casualties of a program that celebrated success by eliminating the workers who created it. But it gets worse. The workers laid off weren't compensated for building the future. One Apollo 11 flight manager, laid off in the early 1970s, found another engineering job at lower pay. His response: "I was bitter about the whole thing. I mean, we went to Houston, trained the astronauts, and all we got was a pink slip. That's the trade. Spend a decade building the most ambitious project in human history. Watch it succeed. Get fired. No pension. No severance matching the accomplishment. No recognition beyond mass layoffs. And when the federal government offered some laid-off NASA contractors alternative employment, the offer was transfer to Vietnam to install communication equipment. Space program gets canceled. War keeps getting funded. The priorities couldn't be clearer. And this is where it turns. Because the workers who built Apollo weren't just losing jobs, they were losing the promise. The Apollo program was sold as the future. Cutting-edge technology, limitless potential, jobs that mattered. Engineers believed they were building a permanent space program, that Apollo 11 was the beginning, not the peak, that moon landings would continue. Mars missions next. Space stations, permanent human presence beyond Earth. That's what Kennedy promised, what NASA advertised, what the workers believed. And then Apollo 11 succeeded, and the budget collapsed. Apollo 20 canceled, January 1970. Apollo 18 and 19 canceled September 1970. The program ended, not because it failed, but because once the goal was reached, Congress saw no reason to continue. The space race won, mission accomplished, funding eliminated. But here's the calculation nobody talks about. Those 400,000 workers represented 400,000 families. Average NASA contractor salary in the 1960s, $8,000 per year. Total payroll, $3.2 billion annually. That money circulated through local economies. Mortgages paid, groceries bought. Schools funded through property taxes. When 50,000 workers got laid off, 50,000 families lost income. And the communities built around NASA facilities lost tax base, customers, and economic stability. Brevard County, Houston, Huntsville, Alabama, New Orleans. All of them built boom economies dependent on NASA spending. And when NASA spending dropped 70% from peak to 1975, those economies collapsed. The workers lost jobs, the communities lost futures. And the federal government moved on to the next priority, which was Vietnam. 1969. 11,780 Americans killed in Vietnam. 21,833 South Vietnamese soldiers killed. The war's deadliest year for American forces. And while NASA prepared to lay off 50,000 workers, the Pentagon had no trouble funding continued operations in Southeast Asia. Defense budget 1969, $81.2 billion. NASA budget same year, $4 billion. 20 times more money for war than space. And when budget cuts came in 1970, NASA lost funding. Vietnam didn't. The war continued until 1975, 6 more years. Thousands more dead. But the Apollo program ended in 1972. Because Congress decided space was optional. War wasn't. This is the betrayal the workers felt. Not that the Apollo program ended, that it was never meant to be permanent. The entire effort, all 400,000 workers, all $25.8 billion, existed only to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. Once that goal achieved, the workers became expendable. NASA didn't build a program. It built a demonstration project. And once the demonstration succeeded, the project shut down. The workers who believed they were building the future discovered they'd been building a publicity stunt. A $25 billion publicity stunt that left them unemployed. But it gets worse. The workers laid off from NASA couldn't easily find equivalent employment because their skills were specialized. Aerospace engineering, rocket propulsion, orbital mechanics. Skills with almost no civilian application in 1970. One laid-off contractor described getting offered transfer to Vietnam for communication equipment installation. That was the alternative. Go to a war zone or lose your job. Those were the options for workers who built the most advanced machines in human history. And thousands chose unemployment over Vietnam deployment because by 1970, Vietnam was recognizably unwinnable. The workers who built the moon rocket watched the federal government abandon them, then watched that same government continue funding a war everyone knew was lost. The bitterness wasn't about unemployment. It was about priorities. July 1971. Apollo 15 launches. Fourth successful moon landing. And NASA workforce down to 29,850. Lowest since 1963. The program continued. But the people who built it were gone, replaced by smaller teams, tighter budgets, reduced ambitions. By the time Apollo 17 launched in December 1972, the final moon mission, NASA's contractor workforce had shrunk by 250,000 people from its peak. 250,000 workers who spent the 1960s building the future and spent the 1970s looking for work, while the federal government spent billions on a war that accomplished nothing, and urban programs that received funding too small to matter. The workers weren't naive. They knew the Apollo program couldn't last forever, but they expected transition, retraining, support. What they got: mass layoffs and a suggestion to deploy to Vietnam. This is what makes it permanent. Once the Apollo workforce scattered, that expertise disappeared. Engineers who understood Saturn V propulsion took jobs in other industries or retired. Technicians who built lunar modules moved to different states, different careers. The institutional knowledge that put humans on the moon dissolved in 2 years. And when NASA tried to restart ambitious programs decades later, they discovered the knowledge was gone, not documented, not preserved, not transferable, because the workers who held it had been laid off, treated as temporary labor on a permanent achievement. And the achievement everyone celebrates was built by people the federal government discarded the moment they finished. 400,000 workers built the greatest technological accomplishment in history. 50,000 of them lost their jobs within a year. Another 200,000 within 5 years. They watched Armstrong step on the moon and knew they were watching their own obsolescence. The rocket launched. The workers fell back to Earth, and nobody caught them. July 16th, 1969. Apollo 11 lifts off from Kennedy Space Center. And 3,900 miles away, in the jungles of South Vietnam, American soldiers continue fighting a war that has no end. 1969 military spending, $25 billion annually on Vietnam operations alone. That's more than the entire Apollo program cost from 1961 through 1969. 8 years of moon missions, $25.8 billion total. 1 year of Vietnam War, $25 billion. And while NASA prepared to lay off 50,000 workers after Apollo 11 succeeded, the Pentagon never reduced troop levels. The priorities were clear: space exploration, temporary; war, permanent. Here's what 1969 looked like in Vietnam. 543,000 American troops deployed. Peak of the war. 11,780 Americans killed. The deadliest year. Average cost per soldier, $83,000 annually. That's $600,000 in today's dollars. Per soldier, per year. 4 times the average NASA contractor salary. And the soldiers weren't building anything. They were fighting an unwinnable war in a country most Americans couldn't locate on a map. While NASA workers built rockets that achieved the impossible, soldiers fought in jungles that would be abandoned 6 years later. One program ended because it succeeded. The other continued for 6 more years despite failing. But here's the calculation that defines 1969. Total direct cost of the Vietnam War, $168.1 billion. That's budgeted war costs from 1965 through 1972, plus military and economic aid to the Saigon regime, Laos, Cambodia, and aid to the French war effort before American involvement, $168 billion. The Apollo program, $25.8 billion. The war cost 6.5 times more than putting humans on the moon. And the war accomplished nothing. 58,000 Americans dead, 3 million Vietnamese dead, Cambodia destabilized, Laos bombed into ruin. And in 1975, North Vietnam won. Every dollar spent, every life lost, changed nothing about the outcome. But nobody cut the defense budget the way they cut NASA's. And this is where it turns. Because both programs were sold the same way. National security, American superiority. Beating the Soviet Union, the space race, and the Vietnam War were two fronts in the Cold War, both justified as existential necessities. But when Apollo 11 succeeded, the space race ended. The goal achieved, the program shut down. Vietnam continued until 1975. 3 more presidents, 6 more years, 30,000 more Americans dead. Because the logic that justified Vietnam didn't require victory. It only required continuation. And that's the difference. Space exploration had a measurable objective. Reach the moon. Mission accomplished. Vietnam had no measurable objective. Stop communism. Defend democracy. Maintain credibility. Goals that could never be achieved, only pursued indefinitely. At $25 billion per year. While NASA got $4 billion, then $3, then forced to cancel future missions. But it gets worse. The soldiers fighting in Vietnam in July 1969 watched the moon landing. In firebase command posts. On small televisions powered by generators. Gathered around radios. They saw Armstrong step onto the moon. And knew they were fighting in a jungle no one cared about. One soldier later described the moon landing as surreal. We put a man on the moon while I'm dodging bullets in a war nobody can explain. That's the disconnect. America capable of impossible technological achievement. Simultaneously trapped in an unwinnable war it refused to leave. And every dollar spent on Vietnam was a dollar that could have continued Apollo, or rebuilt cities, or ended poverty. Instead, it bought 13.7 billion gallons of fuel for military operations, enough to heat 10.8 million American homes for an entire year, burned in a war that ended in defeat. And this is where the propaganda reveals itself. The space race was always about image, demonstrating superiority, proving capability. President Kennedy, 1962, we choose to go to the moon because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. The moon landing wasn't about science. It was about winning. And once won, it had no further value. The Soviet Union used space achievements for ideological propaganda, celebrating cosmonauts as heroes, portraying communist superiority. America did the same. Armstrong and Aldrin as symbols of democratic capitalism's triumph. Both nations using space as Cold War theater. And when the show ended, so did the funding. But Vietnam couldn't be abandoned the same way, because retreat looked like defeat. And defeat threatened American credibility. So the war continued, not because it could be won, because it couldn't be lost visibly. $25 billion per year to maintain the illusion of strength, while actual strength, the ability to achieve the impossible, got defunded. But here's what nobody talks about. The Apollo program produced technology with limited immediate civilian application. Integrated circuits, miniaturized electronics, software systems, all of them revolutionary. None of them immediately useful to ordinary Americans. Tang and Velcro became the punchline because the real technology took decades to matter. The Vietnam War produced nothing. No technology, no strategic advantage, no improved security, just death, debt, demoralization. And it cost 6.5 times more than Apollo. One program gave humanity the moon. The other gave America a memorial wall with 58,000 names. And the federal government prioritized the wall. This is what makes it permanent. Once the decision is made that war spending is non-negotiable and space spending is optional, That priority never reverses. Defense budget 1970, after Apollo 11, $78 billion. NASA budget 1970, $3.7 billion. 21 times more for defense than space. And defense spending never faced the cuts NASA did. No mass layoffs of soldiers the way NASA laid off engineers. No canceled wars the way NASA canceled Apollo 18 through 20. Because defense spending is justified by threat. And threat is infinite. There's always another enemy, another conflict, another reason to maintain funding. Space exploration requires achievement. War only requires fear. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, broadcast to 600 million people worldwide. And while the cameras focused on the moon, 11,780 American families waited for soldiers who would never come home. The moon landing dominated headlines for weeks. The casualties were statistics in the back pages. This is the trade-off America made. Spectacular achievement that cost $25 billion and ended immediately. Catastrophic war that cost $168 billion and continued for 6 more years. One program celebrated, the other ignored until it became impossible to hide. And the federal budget priorities proved which one mattered more. Not the achievement, the distraction. Because here's what the moon landing really was. A demonstration project. Proof that America could accomplish the impossible when it chose to. And the moment it succeeded, the question became, what next? The answer, nothing. No moon base, no Mars mission, no permanent space program, just budget cuts and mass layoffs. While Vietnam continued, not because it was succeeding, because it was too expensive politically to stop. And that's the difference between a program with a goal and a program with momentum. Apollo ended when the goal was reached. Vietnam continued until the money ran out and the public revolted. One required success to justify continuation. The other required continuation to avoid admitting failure. And the federal government chose the one that never had to end. $25 billion per year, forever, until it finally collapsed in 1975, taking credibility, lives, and a generation's trust with it. But the moon landing provided the perfect cover. July 1969. America celebrating technological triumph. Nobody asking how many soldiers died that month. Nobody calculating how much the war cost compared to the space program. Nobody questioning why the budget could always find $25 billion for war, but had to cut NASA funding the moment the mission succeeded. The fireworks were loud enough to drown out the questions. And by the time the celebrations ended, the priorities were locked in. Space, optional. War, essential. Achievement, temporary. Conflict, permanent. The rocket launched. The war continued. And America called it progress. December 19th, 1972. Apollo 17 splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans safe. The final Apollo mission complete. And with it, the era of human moon exploration ends. Not delayed, not paused, ended permanently. For 54 years and counting. This wasn't the plan. Apollo was supposed to be the beginning. Moon bases, Mars missions, permanent human presence in space. That's what Kennedy promised, what NASA planned, what the public expected. Instead, Apollo 17 became the last time humans traveled beyond low Earth orbit. And the reason was simple. Once the moon was reached, nobody wanted to pay to go back. Here's what happened to the Apollo program after the moon landing. Original plan, 20 Apollo missions. Missions actually flown, 17. Apollo 18, 19, then 20 canceled. And the cancellations started immediately. January 4th, 1970. 6 months after Apollo 11. Apollo 20 canceled. The Saturn V rocket, intended for that mission, redirected to launch Skylab instead. Not because the mission was unnecessary, because NASA's budget couldn't support both. September 2nd, 1970. NASA Administrator Thomas Paine announces cancellation of Apollo 15 and 19. Estimated savings, $800 million. And this is where it turns, because the Apollo program didn't end due to technical failure. It ended because once the goal was achieved, the funding evaporated. President Nixon and Congress held NASA to a tightly constrained budget. Fiscal 1970 NASA budget, $3.75 billion. Fiscal 1971 requested, $3.6 billion. Nixon administration approved, $3.27 billion. 10% cut in 1 year. And NASA faced a choice: cancel missions or cancel the future. They chose missions. But here's what the cancellations meant. Apollo program designed for scientific exploration, understanding the moon's composition, origins, geology. 6 missions insufficient to answer first-order scientific questions. The advisory boards warned that reducing missions would seriously jeopardize the ability of the entire Apollo program to address first-order scientific inquiries. Scientists recommended 6 additional missions. They got 4, and the final missions rushed, compressed, limited. No scientist astronauts on the remaining crews despite original plans. Because budget cuts eliminated the time and resources for specialized training. The program designed for exploration became a program for completion. Finish the scheduled missions. Declare victory. Move on. And this is where the promise breaks. The Apollo program was sold as the foundation for permanent space exploration. Kennedy, 1962. We choose to go to the moon in this decade because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. The goal, not just reach the moon, but prove America could do anything. And once proven, use that capability for limitless achievement. Moon bases by 1980, Mars by 1990, permanent orbital stations. That was the vision. The reality, Apollo 17 in 1972. Then nothing. No return missions. No expanded exploration. No permanent presence. Just a program that succeeded and disappeared. But it gets worse. The American public didn't care. When Nixon proposed canceling all remaining lunar landings in August 1971, including Apollo 16 and 17, there was no outcry. His deputy director opposed the cancellation, not because of public pressure, but because of internal government debate. The missions continued, but barely. And when Apollo 17 flew in December 1972, viewership down significantly from Apollo 11. The nation had moved on. The moon landing checked the box, proved a point, won a race. And once won, nobody cared about second place, or third, or sixth, or 12th. The goal was victory, not exploration. And victory achieved, the program became irrelevant. This is what defines 1969. The moon landing wasn't the beginning of a space age. It was the end of a political competition. And the moment the competition ended, so did the investment. NASA budget peaked in 1966, 4.4% of federal spending. By 1975, less than 1%. 75% decline in 6 years. Not because space exploration became less important, because it was never about exploration. It was about beating the Soviet Union. And once beaten, the purpose disappeared. But here's the calculation that makes it permanent. Returning to the moon after Apollo required maintaining infrastructure, Saturn V production, launch facilities, mission control capabilities, trained personnel. All of it expensive, all of it ongoing costs. And once Apollo ended, NASA shut it down. Saturn V production stopped 1970. No more rockets capable of reaching the moon. The tooling, the knowledge, the supply chains, all abandoned. By the 1980s, NASA no longer possessed the capability to return to the moon. Not because the technology was lost, because the infrastructure was dismantled and never rebuilt. Restarting would require redesigning everything from scratch, at costs exceeding the original Apollo program. And no administration since Nixon has been willing to fund that. And this is where the betrayal becomes clear. The workers who built Apollo believed they were building the future. The scientists who designed missions believed they were establishing permanent human presence beyond Earth. The public who funded it believed they were witnessing the beginning of limitless exploration. They were all wrong. Apollo was a $25 billion publicity stunt designed to demonstrate superiority in the Cold War. And once demonstrated, it had no further value. The infrastructure dismantled, the workers laid off, the missions canceled, not because the program failed, because it succeeded at its actual goal, proving America could do what the Soviet Union couldn't. Everything else, exploration, science, human advancement, was marketing. December 14th, 1972. Eugene Cernan becomes the last human to walk on the moon. He doesn't know it at the time. Nobody announces. This is the final moon mission for at least 50 years. But that's what it was. And 54 years later, no human has returned. Not because we can't, because we won't. The political will that funded Apollo existed only as long as the Soviet Union threatened American prestige. Once that threat neutralized, the funding disappeared, and every subsequent attempt to return to the moon faced the same obstacle. Without existential competition, space exploration becomes optional, and optional programs get canceled. But here's what this reveals about 1969. The moon landing wasn't humanity's greatest achievement. It was America's most expensive symbol. A quarter-century of federal budget could have continued Apollo, built moon bases, sent humans to Mars, or rebuilt cities, ended poverty, fixed infrastructure. Instead, it proved a point. America can do the impossible when geopolitical competition requires it. But the moment competition ends, so does the impossible. Apollo 11 succeeded in July 1969. The program canceled by September 1970. 14 months from triumph to termination. The fastest any successful federal program has ever been abandoned. And this is what the fireworks in 1969 were really celebrating. Not the beginning of a space age. The end of political necessity. The space race won. The Soviets beaten. The goal achieved. Mission accomplished. Literally. And once accomplished, no reason to continue. $25 billion spent to reach the moon. Then the infrastructure demolished to save $800 million. The workers laid off to cut costs. The missions canceled to balance budgets. The future that lasted 3 years. From July 1969 to September 1970. The shortest era of limitless human potential in history. Because it was never about potential. It was about competition. And when the competition ended, the potential became too expensive. The rocket launched. The future stayed on the ground. And everyone pretended the moon landing proved we could do anything. When it actually proved we'd only do anything if we had to beat someone else doing it. The moment we won, we stopped trying. And 54 years later, we still haven't gone back. 1970, the year infrastructure investment in the United States began its permanent decline. State and local government capital spending as a share of budgets drops sharply and never recovers. Infrastructure stock as percentage of GDP starts falling and continues falling for 54 years. Not gradually, not subtly. A large, close to monotonic decline that begins precisely when Apollo ends. And no other developed nation follows this pattern. Only the United States. The country that just proved it could accomplish the impossible decided to stop trying. Here's what happened to American ambition after the moon landing. Interstate highway system. Authorized 1956. Completed 1992. Total cost $114 billion over 36 years. the largest public works project in American history, built across 4 decades, through 8 administrations, during boom and recession, never canceled, never defunded, never questioned, because it was infrastructure, essential, ongoing, permanent investment. And it worked, generated $742 billion in annual economic value by 2021, a project that paid for itself 7 times over. But after Apollo, America never attempted anything at that scale again. Not for infrastructure, not for cities, not for education, not for health care. The ambition that built the interstate highway system from 1956 to 1992 disappeared in 1970, right when the moon landing stopped. And this is where it turns, because Apollo proved America could do anything, if it had to, for a limited time, against an enemy. Interstate highways took 36 years because there was no deadline, no competition, no space race equivalent, just sustained investment in something essential. Apollo took 8 years because Kennedy set a deadline. The Soviet Union provided competition, and once the goal was met, it ended. The problem: every major challenge facing America after 1969 required sustained investment, not 8-year sprints, 30-year marathons. Cities needed rebuilding over decades. Poverty required generational intervention. Infrastructure demanded continuous maintenance and expansion. But America in 1970 had just learned that problems get solved with short-term mobilization, not long-term commitment. And when the problems couldn't be solved in 8 years, they got abandoned. Here's the pattern that defines everything after Apollo. Federal infrastructure spending 1950 to 1960, 6 to 7% of budget. 1970 to 1980, 5%. 1990 to 2000, 4%. 2010 to 2020, 3.5%. 50% decline over 50 years. While roads aged, bridges deteriorated. Water systems failed. Power grids strained. The infrastructure built during the interstate highway era required maintenance, and America stopped paying for it. Not because the money didn't exist, because the political will for sustained investment disappeared after Apollo proved spectacular short-term achievements were possible. But it's worse. State and local capital investment. 1970, 25% of all state and local spending. Today, 15%. 40% decline in infrastructure as a budget priority. And this happened across 42 states, not regional, not political, not economic, nationwide abandonment of long-term investment. Starting precisely in 1970, the year after Apollo 11, the year NASA's budget began collapsing, the year America decided that if a project couldn't be completed in a decade, it wasn't worth starting. And this is where the betrayal becomes visible. The generation that built the interstate highway system believed in multi-decade projects. They started construction in 1956, knowing completion was 36 years away. They funded it every year, through recessions, wars, political turnover, because infrastructure is essential, even when it takes decades. The generation that watched the moon landing learned the opposite lesson. Big projects should be fast, spectacular, definitive, and if they can't be finished within a decade, they're failures. This is why America stopped building ambitious infrastructure after 1970. Not because the engineering became impossible, because the political patience disappeared. Apollo set an expectation. National priorities should be achievable within a presidential term. Anything longer became politically impossible to sustain. But here's the calculation that makes it permanent. Interstate highway system cost $114 billion over 36 years. Average annual spending $3.2 billion. Sustained, predictable, boring. Apollo program cost $25.8 billion over 8 years. Average annual spending $3.2 billion, exact same average annual cost. But Apollo got celebrated as humanity's greatest achievement. Interstate highways got taken for granted because highways took too long. No dramatic finish, no single moment of triumph, just decades of construction, maintenance, expansion, exactly the kind of project that becomes politically invisible. And after Apollo, politicians learned spectacular beats sustainable, even when sustainable delivers more value. 1975. New York City nearly defaults on municipal bonds. Infrastructure crumbling, services cut, 40,000 workers laid off. The city asks for federal assistance. President Ford's response: solve your own problems. No Apollo-scale federal mobilization to save American cities. No 8-year crash program to rebuild urban infrastructure. Just austerity, budget cuts, managed decline. Because cities can't be fixed in 8 years. They require 30 years of sustained investment. And America in 1975 no longer had the patience for that. Apollo taught the wrong lesson. Not we can do anything, but we can do anything fast. And when fast isn't possible, nothing gets done. But it gets worse. The infrastructure decline starting in 1970 coincided with massive budget deficits. Not because revenue dropped, because priorities changed. Defense spending, always funded, always increased, never questioned. Infrastructure spending, cut every decade. The logic: defense protects against external threats. Infrastructure just maintains what already exists. Defense is urgent. Infrastructure can wait. Except infrastructure can't wait. Deferred maintenance compounds. Systems fail. Costs multiply. By 2000, America needed trillions to repair infrastructure deferred since 1970. And every administration chose short-term spending over long-term investment. Because Apollo proved short-term wins elections. Long-term just costs money. And this is where the pattern becomes irreversible. Once infrastructure spending drops below a critical threshold, catching up becomes prohibitively expensive. Maintenance deferred in 1970 requires complete replacement in 2000, at 10 times the cost. A bridge repaired annually for 50 years costs less than rebuilding it once after 50 years of neglect. But annual maintenance is politically invisible. Complete collapse makes headlines. So politicians deferred maintenance to avoid budget battles. And when systems finally failed decades later, rebuilding cost more than continuous investment would have. The math always favored sustained investment. The politics never did. And after Apollo, politics determined infrastructure spending. Not engineering, not economics. Just short-term political calculations optimized for re-election. This is what Apollo really cost. Not $25.8 billion. But the death of long-term thinking. The interstate highway system took 36 years because the generation that built it understood. Essential things take time. Apollo took 8 years because Kennedy set a deadline to beat the Soviets. And once Apollo succeeded, the 8-year model became the template. Every major challenge after 1969 got evaluated by one question. Can this be finished in a decade? If yes, maybe it gets funded. If no, it's abandoned before it starts. Infrastructure takes decades. Abandoned. Urban rebuilding takes generations. Abandoned. Poverty elimination requires sustained intervention. Abandoned. Education reform needs continuous funding. Abandoned. All of them sacrificed because they couldn't be completed within a presidential term. And the country that put humans on the moon in 8 years couldn't repair a bridge over 20. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong steps onto the moon, proof that America can accomplish the impossible. And 57 years later, America still hasn't repaired the infrastructure built in the 1950s. Because repairing infrastructure isn't impossible. It's boring. And after Apollo, boring stopped getting funded. The generation that watched the moon landing inherited crumbling roads built by their grandparents. Not because the roads couldn't be maintained, because maintaining roads doesn't win space races, doesn't beat enemies, doesn't produce spectacular televised moments, just keeps civilization functioning. And after 1969, that wasn't enough. This is what the moon landing taught America. Not, we can do anything, but we only do things if they make us look better than someone else. Interstate highways made life better, but didn't beat the Soviets. So they got built over 36 years by a generation that valued function over spectacle. Apollo made America look superior, but didn't make life better. So it got built in 8 years by a generation that valued spectacle over function. And when that generation took power in the 1970s, they stopped funding function, only spectacle. The problem: you can't maintain a civilization on spectacle. You need sustained investment in boring essentials: roads, bridges, water, power, education, health, all of it requiring decades of unglamorous spending, none of it producing moon landing moments. And after Apollo proved spectacular achievements were possible, sustained investments became politically impossible. The rocket launched in 1969. Infrastructure investment started declining in 1970. And for 54 years, America has chosen short-term spectacle over long-term sustainability. Not because sustainability is too expensive, because it's too slow, takes too long, produces no dramatic moments, doesn't fit in an 8-year program. The moon landing was humanity's greatest achievement, and the worst example America could have set for itself, because it proved the impossible was possible, as long as it could be done quickly, against an enemy, with a deadline. Everything else got abandoned. And 57 years later, America still hasn't figured out how to maintain what it built before it decided only moonshots mattered. This isn't about villains. It's not about NASA making wrong choices or politicians failing their duty. It's about what happens when a nation learns the wrong lesson from its greatest achievement. The moon landing proved America could do the impossible. And 57 years later, America is still trying to recreate that moment instead of solving problems that require decades of work nobody watches. This is the mechanism that made everything after 1969 inevitable. Not failure, spectacle. Here's what most people believe about the Apollo program: that it enjoyed overwhelming public support, that America rallied behind the space program, that the 1960s were a golden age of national unity around exploration. None of that is true. Public support for increased NASA spending never exceeded 53% during the entire Apollo era. Most Americans opposed spending more on space exploration throughout the 1960s. Even in 1969, the year of the moon landing, only 53% supported maintaining NASA funding. The public was never enthusiastically behind Apollo. They just weren't strongly opposed. And that mild acquiescence was enough. Because Apollo wasn't sustained by public support. It was sustained by political spectacle. Here's how it worked. President Kennedy announces in 1962, "We are going to the moon." Not because it's scientifically necessary, not because the public demands it, because beating the Soviet Union required a visible, dramatic achievement. The space race was political theater. Two superpowers competing on the world stage. Each launch a performance. Each success a propaganda victory. And the audience wasn't the American public. It was the rest of the world. Countries deciding whether capitalism or communism represented the future. The moon landing answered that question. America won. Capitalism superior. Soviet Union defeated. And the moment the performance ended, so did the funding. But here's what this created. A template for how America solves problems. Not through sustained investment in boring necessities. Through dramatic, televised achievements that demonstrate superiority. This is called spectacle politics. And it works like this. Control attention through dramatic events. divert focus from complex problems, legitimize authority through mass-mediated displays. The moon landing perfected the model. Problem: Soviet Union appears technologically superior. Solution: dramatic demonstration of American capability. Result: attention captured. Rival defeated. Authority legitimized. No long-term commitment required. Just one spectacular moment that changes perception. And this is where it becomes permanent. Once spectacle works, it becomes the only strategy that gets funded. Because spectacle generates media coverage. Media coverage shapes public perception. Perception influences elections. Sustained investment in infrastructure doesn't generate coverage. It takes decades. No dramatic moments. No televised triumphs. Politicians can't campaign on, "We maintained bridges for 30 years without collapse." They can campaign on, "We built the most advanced system ever conceived." Even if the advanced system gets canceled after completion. Even if the maintained bridges deliver more value. Spectacle wins elections. Maintenance doesn't. Here's the proof. 50 years after Apollo, public support for space exploration remains stable. 80% favor maintaining current NASA funding, same as 1965. But ask what NASA's priorities should be. 60% say monitor asteroids. 50% say monitor climate. Only 12% say send humans to the moon. 12% say send humans to Mars. The public wants NASA focused on practical, protective, ongoing missions. Not spectacle, not flags on other planets. Just sustained work that keeps Earth safe. But that's not what gets funded. Artemis program, returned humans to the moon. Multi-decade timeline. Hundreds of billions projected. Climate monitoring, consistently underfunded. No dramatic milestones. No televised countdowns. The public prefers one. Politicians fund the other. Because moon landings generate headlines, climate monitoring generates data. And data doesn't win elections. But it gets worse. Even spectacular missions don't sustain attention anymore. Artemis 1 launched November 2022. Successful mission. Major milestone toward returning humans to the moon. Public reaction, minimal. No increase in support for human space exploration. No surge in NASA approval. The spectacle formula stopped working. Because spectacle requires novelty. The first moon landing was novel. Unprecedented. Impossible made real. The second moon landing in 2026 is repetition. Expected. Possible made routine. And routine doesn't generate the attention that justifies massive spending. This is the trap. Spectacle politics only works for first achievements. But problems requiring sustained solutions need funding after the first achievement, after the novelty disappears, after media attention fades, after elections move on to new spectacles. And this is where the mechanism locks. Politicians learned from Apollo. Dramatic achievements generate support, so they pursue dramatic achievements. Infrastructure repair, not dramatic, doesn't get funded. Urban rebuilding, not dramatic, doesn't get funded. Poverty elimination, not dramatic, doesn't get funded. None of them produce moon landing moments. They just require decades of unglamorous work that never makes headlines. And without headlines, politicians can't demonstrate achievement. Without demonstrated achievement, they can't win re-election. Without re-election, they can't pursue long-term projects. The system optimizes for spectacle, not solutions. But here's what makes it irreversible. Once spectacle becomes the metric, solutions that can't be spectacular get abandoned before they start. Not because they won't work, because they can't generate the attention that justifies political risk. Climate change requires 50 years of sustained emissions reduction. No single moment of triumph. No televised victory. Just gradual improvement measured in parts per million. Politicians can't campaign on, "We reduced atmospheric carbon by 0.03% this year." They can campaign on, "We landed on Mars." Even if Mars landing accomplishes nothing, even if carbon reduction saves millions of lives, spectacle generates attention. Solutions generate results. And attention determines funding. This isn't conspiracy. It's incentive structure. Media covers dramatic events. Politicians need media coverage. Dramatic events get funded. Sustained programs lack drama. Media ignores them. Politicians abandon them. The cycle self-reinforces. Every abandoned long-term program proves long-term programs don't work politically. Every successful spectacle proves spectacle is the only strategy that works. And 57 years after Apollo, the pattern is permanent. America still chases moon landing moments, still defunds boring maintenance, still prioritizes spectacular demonstrations over sustained solutions. Not because spectacle solves more problems, because spectacle wins more attention. And in a political system where attention determines funding, spectacle always wins. July 20th, 1969. 600 million people watch Neil Armstrong step onto the moon, the most watched event in human history. And in that moment, America learned that capturing global attention was worth $25 billion. That spectacle could win the Cold War. That dramatic achievement justified any cost. What America didn't learn: how to maintain what it built once the cameras turned off. The moon landing ended the space race, but it started something worse: the permanent pursuit of spectacle over substance, of 8-year victories over 30-year solutions, of televised triumphs over invisible maintenance. And this is why nothing after Apollo looked like Apollo. Not because America lost capability, because it lost patience. Interstate highway system took 36 years because the generation that built it valued function over performance. They didn't need highways to win elections. Highways just needed to work. Apollo took 8 years because the generation that funded it valued performance over function. They didn't need the moon landing to improve life. It just needed to demonstrate superiority. And once performance became the priority, function became optional. Infrastructure that works isn't performance. It's just infrastructure. Cities that function aren't dramatic. They're just cities. Poverty eliminated gradually isn't triumph. It's just policy. None of it generates the attention that spectacle does. None of it wins elections. None of it gets funded. This is the mechanism, not villainy, not conspiracy, not incompetence. Just rational actors responding to incentive structures created by spectacle politics. Politicians need attention to win elections. Spectacle generates attention. Solutions generate results, but not attention. So politicians pursue spectacle. Solutions get abandoned. And the system never corrects, because correction requires exactly the kind of sustained, unglamorous work that spectacle politics makes impossible. The rocket launched in 1969, and it taught America that problems get solved with dramatic gestures. That 8 years of focused effort can accomplish anything. That televised triumph is worth more than invisible maintenance. 57 years later, American infrastructure crumbles because maintenance doesn't make headlines. Cities decay because rebuilding takes generations, not election cycles. Climate change accelerates because solutions require sustained work, not spectacular demonstrations. And every few years, politicians propose a new moonshot for cancer, for energy, for technology, programs designed to capture attention, generate headlines, win elections. Most of them canceled before completion. Because the attention moves on, the headlines fade. The next election demands a new spectacle, and the boring work of actually solving problems never gets done. This is what the moon landing cost. Not $25 billion, but the understanding that real solutions take longer than attention spans. That maintenance matters more than monuments. That the goal isn't to do something spectacular once. It's to do something necessary continuously. The generation that built the interstate highway system understood that. The generation that watched the moon landing forgot it. And 57 years later, America still hasn't remembered. Because spectacular is more profitable than sustainable. Dramatic is more fundable than dependable. And attention is more valuable than achievement. The moon landing was humanity's greatest achievement, and the worst lesson America could have learned from it, because it proved we can do anything, as long as the whole world is watching, and nothing matters if they aren't.